She is a 2023 Saybrook graduate in mind-body medicine. Her doctoral research focused on the lived experience of mind wandering for young adults with ADHD. She currently teaches at the University of Nevada, Reno, while also working to translate her dissertation research into a book and journal articles. Additionally, she works with youth and their families in her private practice as a mind-body wellness practitioner and facilitates equine-assisted learning groups focused on stress management, social skills, and youth development. Take it away, Margann. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Moss. I appreciate it. I'm excited to be here tonight. I love this research, and so I'm always so grateful for an opportunity to share it. We'll just jump right in. Let me give you an overview. Tonight, we're going to just start with I want to give you a little introduction, why mind wandering, why ADHD, and preview my research question. I'm going to talk a little bit about the literature because it gives you a good background to understand the findings that I came to, as well as the methodology and data and analysis that I use before I move into the discussion, and then offer some thoughts about needs for future research. So why mind wandering? As this quote from William James, the father of American psychology, shows, as far back as the late 1800s, there was interest in mind wandering. This interest was particularly related to distractibility in children. However, mind wandering was also thought to be related to consciousness. In contemporary times, we found from a neuroscience and mental health perspective that mind wandering accounts for nearly 50% of waking cognitive activity. It's the primary symptom and identifying feature of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. ADHD and mind wandering share brain networks that manage attention, memory, emotional regulation, and cognitive control, as well as resulting in similar functional impairments in daily life. If we can attain a better understanding of mind wandering, then we may also gain insight and understanding into the affective and cognitive landscapes of individuals with ADHD. Additionally, there are social, epistemological, and personal reasons to study mind wandering with ADHD. Today, nearly 10% of American children between the ages of 2 and 17 are diagnosed with this disorder, yielding more than 16 million adults with this chronic neurodevelopmental diagnosis. It affects social, professional, and academic performance, as well as mental health, safety, and substance use. Typical explanations and treatments for ADHD are based in allopathic medicine and concepts of pathology. An integrative mind-body medicine focus, as well as strength-based perspectives from creativity studies and positive psychology, are missing from conceptualizations and interventions for ADHD. Additionally, there's a gap in the literature regarding the lived experience of ADHD. It's one of the only diagnoses in the DSM that's context dependent and based primarily on the observations and interpretations of others. Our understanding of ADHD is missing the expertise of the people who live it. Finally, my study is motivated by my personal interests as a psychotherapist, a learning coach, and the mother of children with ADHD. I've witnessed the whimsy, creativity, impulsivity, and also the negative consequences and challenges of having ADHD. Typical interventions often offer little help, and I have tremendous compassion and curiosity about being neurodivergent in a world that has little space or know-how to honor these differences. So this brings me to my research question. What's the lived experience and meaning of mind wandering for young adults with ADHD? We've already talked about why it's a problem and the purpose of my study, so moving on. I framed my study under the umbrella of mind-body medicine, using an integrative and humanistic lens to explore my topic from the standpoints of neuroscience and psychology, while also integrating a critical theoretical stance, looking at historical and social context for understanding mind wandering, and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or as it was called as early as 1775, disordered attention. My literature review covered 9 areas, starting with definitions and explanations for mind wandering. My working definition for my study was that mind wandering is a universal human experience of unguided, self-generated, flowing thought that shifts our attention from external tasks to internal mental activity. In the early 1990s, psychological interest in mind wandering was revitalized, resulting in a number of theories and neuroscientific investigations. Studies focused on task-unrelated thought, self-generated thought, and the relationship between spontaneous thought and cognitive constraints. Researchers argued about whether things like rumination, which is highly constrained, or daydreaming, which is the opposite, could both be considered mind wandering. And then, as with all good science, researchers tested their hypotheses using a variety of assessments, thought probes, observations, as well as neuroimaging to map brain activity and correlate it with findings from lab-based behavioral and psychological studies. My literature review went on to investigate the difference between intentional and unintentional mind wandering and discern the established phenomenological features of mind wandering before diving into the literature to establish the connection between mind wandering and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. In the last 2 decades, researchers began to find that ADHD and mind wandering share many experiential qualities. They also involve the same regions of the brain. However, the relationship between mind wandering and ADHD is probably most easily recognized through the overlap of functional impairments that are attributed to both, including poor academic performance, workplace difficulties, affective dysregulation, and diminished cognitive control. The mind wandering theory of ADHD was articulated about 6 years ago, challenging dominant yet unproven assumptions about the causes of ADHD. And subsequently, another theory was advanced, the idea of cognitive disengagement syndrome. That's a tongue twister. And it's an alternative to ADHD to better explain the relationship between mind wandering and the functional impairments that are noted. Across the literature, many authors reference the influence that awareness or mindfulness has on the occurrence and outcomes of mind wandering. Meditative practices to cultivate meta-awareness are thought to mediate spontaneous mind wandering and mental activity, as well as reactive emotional responses. Additionally, sensory engagement through things like music and movement increase arousal and strengthen the mind-body connection, further mediating mind wandering episodes. Finally, before moving into my methodology and analysis, I established the philosophical framework for my study with my literature review. The methodology I used, interpretative phenomenological analysis, is rooted in the philosophical and theoretical lineages of pragmatism, symbolic interactionism, phenomenology, hermeneutics, and ideography. These ideas are essential to IPA's interpretive commitment. My literature review provided 4 foundations for my analysis: understanding the established neurological features of mind wandering, the phenomenological features, the relationship between mind wandering and ADHD, and the philosophical underpinning that helped me make sense of my data. Neurologically, the discovery of the default mode network a little over 20 years ago cast mind wandering in a whole new light. Prior to the discovery of this network, neuroscientists thought that the brain was basically inactive when not engaged in deliberate processing of external tasks. However, through mapping of brain activity using functional MRI, researchers discovered that resting state activity takes place in the default mode network relating to mental imagery, dreaming, and thought streams that are divorced from external stimuli. The default mode network is where we mentally rehearse future events, engage in self-referential and inner-guided thought. This network works with the executive control network, toggling back and forth between external task-focused thought and internally directed cognition. Some researchers hypothesize that in ADHD, it's this switch that actually gets stuck and people remain in that default mode. Discovery of the default mode network catalyzed the development of progressive theories of mind wandering. Initial theoretical constructs were based kind of on the idea of like competing cognitive resources. Then came along the content regulation hypotheses, which tried to make sense of the relationship between mind wandering and emotion, and proposed that the affective responses to mind wandering depended on the content of the experience. The dynamic mind wandering framework tried to define mind wandering as self-referential thought processes that could be distinguished from other similar processes like planning or ruminating because of low cognitive constraints. Finally, the family resemblances theory took all of that and looked at the competing ideas about mind wandering and posited that they could actually be complementary if you viewed them as different ways of identifying and understanding mind wandering under a heterogeneous conceptual umbrella. Things like mindfulness, creativity, and daydreaming would also fit under that umbrella. Phenomenologically, mind wandering has 5 primary features: temporal orientation, perceptual decoupling, affective mood, trait qualities, self-relevance, and creativity. Mind wandering rarely focuses on the present moment. It's directed to thoughts either in the future or the past. Additionally, future-oriented mind wandering is generally experienced more positively, while past-oriented mind wandering tends to have negative emotional effect, resulting in mood changes. These effects on emotion and mood are mediated by self-relevance, intentionality, and also by personality traits and patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving. Finally, mind wandering aligns closely with constructs of creativity, including being used to engage in problem solving, adapt to new situations, or playfully engage in routine tasks. ADHD is most commonly identified as a persistent pattern of inattention, sometimes accompanied by impulsivity and hyperactivity that interferes with typical daily life functioning. Inattention is clinically defined as wandering off task in the current Diagnostic and Statistics Manual of Mental Disorders. So mind wandering is a primary feature of ADHD. Additionally, there's overlap in the neural networks associated with ADHD and mind wandering, and as mentioned, they share functional impairments. Distractibility became pathologized in the 1800s when inattention and misbehavior were characterized as an inherent deficit of self-control and something to be punished and gotten rid of in the service of productive child labor and the move to simultaneous group instruction during the Industrial Revolution. Understanding these contexts provides a critical lens for interpreting contemporary understandings of ADHD and mind wandering and interpreting the data from my study. I used interpretative phenomenological analysis to conduct this study. IPA is a methodology from the lineage of hermeneutic phenomenology, a way to study and interpret language and make meaning and understand the essence of a phenomenon using an ideographic lens. In IPA, this is done by engaging in an iterative cycle of understanding, employing the hermeneutic circle to distill how the participants understand the phenomenon that's under investigation. IPA is interpretive and reflexive, and well suited for questions situated within the psychological explorations of the human condition. Interpretative phenomenological analysis focuses on understanding the individual's lived experiences and sharing the voice of participants as they make sense of those experiences. Additionally, I employed a critical hermeneutic lens to better understand how mind wandering has been historically understood and pathologized, and how this might actually influence participants' efforts of meaning making. For my study, my participants were 8 young adults, aged 19 to 25, with a formal diagnosis of ADHD. I selected this group because they developmentally can engage in abstract thinking and self-reflection, but they were also young enough that they could easily remember their childhood experiences. And I recruited them through mailers and advertisements on a national ADHD website. Data was gathered using semi-structured interviews. This graphic shows that my analytic process began with an idiographic focus, moving case by case to develop personal experiential themes before moving on to group themes, always remembering that IPA focuses on the voices of the participants. Theme development is done in an iterative process of writing and then circling back and around between the part and the whole of the data to engage in the double hermeneutic circle of the researcher making sense of how the participants are making sense of their mind-wandering experiences. And then this shows a step-by-step breakdown of my analytic process to support the rigor and trustworthiness of the analysis. I started with 203 pages of verbatim transcripts, and using descriptive, linguistic, and conceptual noting derived 54 personal experiential themes, and these supported the identification of 3 group themes and sub-themes. So these are an example of some of my favorite and most descriptive personal experiential themes. Especially note the disparities and the contradictions. They go from being trapped to feeling like a ray of sunshine, and kind of everything in between. And you'll see that there's a lot of noting of movement. There's bouncing and slipping and popping. So these are a really good example of the ways that individually my participants experience their mind wandering. Iterative analysis yielded patterns in the data, describing consistent phenomenological features. Exploring convergence and divergence in participants' accounts illuminated the meaning that mind-wandering experiences held for them. So my first group theme was that mind wandering is an internally focused mental activity. Second, personal circumstances influence mind wandering. And third, mind wandering is an aspect of identity. My first group experiential theme has 4 sub-themes. And this really speaks to the phenomenology of it. The mind-body split, random and fast moving, constant distraction, and letting go. The mind-body split refers to diminished conscious awareness, like disappearing from the present moment. And these quotes show that. Participants experience mind wandering as continuous movement and noise, thoughts that are random and jump and bounce and race and pop. Mind wandering is loud and interrupting. It's catalyzed by external and internal stimuli and a constant internal dialogue that's persistent and diverting. But sometimes it was different. Sometimes mind wandering is about letting their minds wander to solve problems, to plan, or to take a mental break. Participants repeatedly referenced letting go or just letting my mind wander. In the second group theme, personal circumstances influence the meaning of mind wandering. These circumstances fell into 3 sub-themes, related to others, related to self, and related to boredom. This sub-theme pertains to how participants experience mind wandering via their relationships, how others reacted to them, and to living in the world. Mind wandering in the context of others was equated with feeling bad, misunderstood, and was problematic. A recurrent thread in participant accounts was feeling othered, marginalized, and always misunderstood. Here, in mind wandering related to self, quotes began to show some of the paradox that emerges in different contexts. Mind wandering related to self when no one else is involved is comfortable, entertaining, and it's a way to de-stress. And mind wandering was highly related to boredom for everyone in the study. It happens when they don't feel stimulated or engaged. And then, like one of them said, for sure, it just happens. In the third and final group theme, mind wandering is an aspect of personality, the sub-themes, who am I, the only way I know, and life experiences influence perceptions of self emerged. Participants voiced that mind wandering was intrinsically a part of their identity and their sense of self. It was unchanging and inseparable from who they were. It was often difficult for participants to talk about mind wandering because they had no frame of reference for what life would be like without its constant presence. It was interesting to also hear several participants say they were surprised to learn as they got older that not everyone experienced mind wandering the way they did. And this is really important because they didn't know that other people didn't experience it this way, when they got in trouble or couldn't perform at the same level as their peers, it didn't make any sense to them. They didn't understand what was going on or how to change it. Participants' stories showed how mind wandering related to others influenced introjections about their self and formed internalized narratives about the phenomenon. But as you can see from the quotes, these were not positive or empowered narratives for anyone. My findings align with existing knowledge about mind wandering and ADHD in many ways. The descriptions closely fit with knowledge about the function of the default mode and executive control networks. The phenomenological features in the first group theme align with knowledge about perceptual decoupling and temporal orientation. Participants described associations between content, affect, and intentionality that match the literature. And areas where participant stories diverged from each other may suggest varying degrees of cognitive constraint. The internalizing focus that showed up in the second group theme and third support the position that further research is warranted to develop the concept of cognitive disengagement syndrome and to differentiate it from ADHD. And my study added new and different knowledge to our understanding of mind wandering with ADHD. The phenomenon of mind wandering is a felt experience. The brain slips away. As one person said, it just goes right out the back door. It's fast, it's racing, it's bouncing. Participants talked about feeling time blindness. They had no sense of time passing. They needed external sensory cues like noise or touch to bring them back to embodied presence. And somatically based mindfulness practices helped mediate mind wandering. Additionally, sensory inputs that increase arousal help to mediate mind wandering, like music and fidgeting. Importantly, there was no feeling of control over mind wandering that any participant could ever think of reporting. Context impacts the meaning of mind wandering. Mind wandering negatively affects relationships with others and with self. Descriptions of feeling misunderstood and othered peppered the interviews. Participants felt alone to try to manage the consequences of their mind wandering. And this caused a great deal of emotional distress, which then fed into further mind wandering in the form of reliving negative experiences. This may contribute to the high rate of anxiety and depression, which are often comorbid with ADHD. Mind wandering creates a paradox in their lives, a double bind, so to speak, because mind wandering is a primary way to re-energize, refocus, plan, problem solve, to engage in creative thought, but it's also a source of conflicts, of censure, and of shame. Mind wandering is a fundamental aspect of an individual's self-identity. Prior mind wandering research demonstrated that self-referential and autobiographical thought influence mind wandering content, and that mind wandering is a way to process memory and emotion and develop a personal narrative framework. My study goes further to show how stories about mind wandering become a part of participants' narrative identity, affecting how they see themselves and who they are in the world. This opens up new avenues for thinking about interventions and future research that can address both the costs and the benefits of mind wandering in more constructive ways. As a scholar practitioner, it's super important to me that I identify the bridge between research and practice. These findings highlight 3 areas where support for people with ADHD could be aided: a shift in perceptions about mind wandering, improving individualized support, and helping people develop agency and empowerment. For a shift in perceptions, we need to acknowledge the uncontrollable nature of mind wandering and its effect on conscious awareness. There's harm when an unalienable feature of the self gets looked down on, and we need to increase our empathy through enhanced understanding, respond with compassion, with patience, with sensitivity, and we need to really focus on inclusion and self-esteem to build self-esteem and self-compassion. Some key questions. I think that it's important for parents, teachers, therapists, people who live and work with people with ADHD. We can ask, how does my understanding of the internal experience of mind wandering inform my perspective? How do I impact the environment of someone who mind wanders? And how am I fostering their positive sense of self? We need to improve support. Typical interventions are marginally helpful and new ways are needed. We have to step away from prescriptive remedies and punitive consequences and employ mind-body practices. We can develop strength-based approaches to personal challenges and allow and encourage self-guided development of strategies to aid in focus, like movement for embodied awareness or music for optimal arousal. All the participants in my study reported that they knew things to do to take care of themselves and help themselves focus, but they were rarely allowed to use those skills. Finally, and this goes along with my own humanistic orientation, we need to practice unconditional positive regard. So some questions for this area: how does my understanding of the internal experience of mind wandering inform the way I offer support and identify strengths? How can I facilitate a supportive environment? And how does my support aid in the construction of positive self-concept? In terms of agency empowerment, we need to provide pathways to change narratives about the phenomenon and about self. This includes interrupting cycles of learned helplessness and upholding the value of creativity and divergent thinking. We need to find ways to facilitate autonomy and intrinsic motivation and encourage and amplify personal relevance. We can ask ourselves, how does my understanding of the internal experience of mind wandering inform the way I encourage agency and empowerment? How can I facilitate an environment that decreases aversive experiences and amplifies the benefits that are often associated with mind wandering? And how can I foster an empowered sense of self? This leads to the need for future research. The findings from my study suggest that there may be a link between mind wandering and experiences of trauma that needs to be further investigated. People also talked a lot about not feeling any power and losing their motivation. So self-determination theory may be something that we can study further in its application to ADHD and mind wandering. And we should definitely explore the relationship between personality trait characteristics and effective responses to mind wandering. Finally, well, not quite finally, because I have one more that's new that I added, but we need to explore the relationship a little more between mind wandering, cognitive disengagement syndrome, and ADHD. The findings suggest that there's some value there. Looking at those functional impairments, they seem to align a little bit more with this new idea of cognitive disengagement syndrome, and we may find improved diagnostic accuracy and intervention strategies through that research. Then finally, another area of research is to explore the biological need to belong. This was a theory that was promoted in the late 1990s, and I actually was completely unfamiliar with it till I was recently teaching a sociology class and came across it. And the first thing I thought about were the findings from my own study. This biological need to belong, which was such a source of conflict and pain from my participants may really influence perceptions of mind wandering and the self in relation to ADHD, and could be a fruitful area for further exploration. Some final thoughts. I think it's appropriate to just end with the voice of one of my participants who said, I think a lot of times there was a tendency to be like, oh, that's so different. That's so hard. Like, that's a tragedy. You have to live that way. But that's not how I view it. I think it would be very dangerous to treat ADHD and the symptoms as a tragedy, even as we understand how difficult they can be in a world that isn't designed for that. I started my study hoping to show that there was an unrealized benefit to mind wandering. Thinking of all the creative, whimsical stories I've heard as a therapist, I wanted to share that side. But the data told a more complex, nuanced, and often painful story that needs to be understood and honored. Conversations with my students at my local university affirmed and reinforced my findings for me over the last 6 months. This inspires me and gives me confidence to find ways to share this work, to research more, and to help change the support that we give to youth and to all people with ADHD. Thank you so much for listening and for sharing this with me, and I look forward to our discussion. I have references at the end if anyone's interested.